I'm Dr. Seraphy, a senior curator of global fashions and textiles here at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I'm delighted you could join us today for our ROM Connects program, produced in support of the ROM-original exhibition, The Cloth That Changed the World, India's Printed and Painted Cottons, which is on view now in the Patricia Harris Gallery of Fashion and Textiles. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Nation, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. In a moment, we will broadcast a pre-recorded presentation of the making of our special exhibition.
Here you see a few overviews of the full exhibit, which is on view in the ROM's Patricia Harris Gallery of Textiles and Costume. It features 60 painted and printed cottons made in India, both historic and contemporary. Now, the majority of the pieces on display comes from the ROM's own renowned collection, but we also have featured a few key international loans, and some have never been seen before in any museum. The pieces cover a time period from 1250 AD to the year 2000. We have on display pieces that were made in India for export to 4 continents, to Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. As our exhibit covers 750 years and 4 continents, I like to joke it took a very big village to create it and tell the global story of India's painted and printed cottons. From the beginning, it became clear that we needed a large multidisciplinary team that included art historians, fashion historians, economic historians, anthropologists, practicing artists, and even a botanist. So while I served as lead curator, I was guided and helped throughout by 3 ROM curators. They include Dr. Dipali Diwan of our South Asia Art and Culture section, Dr. Alexandra Palmer, my co-curator of Global Fashion and Textiles, and Deborah Metzger, who is the ROM's assistant curator of botany. And why we needed a botanist on the exhibit, I'll have more to say about later. Partly it was for help on the natural dye story, but also to help us identify some of the amazing flowers, plants, and even some mammals that we will see on the different examples of Indian chintz. Now, we also called on external colleagues to help advise on specific objects and stories. They are first and foremost Doctors Ruth Barnes, Ilanid Edwards, and Rajarshi Sengupta, located in the United States, the United Kingdom, and India. And for our companion book, Cloth That Changed the World, The Art and Fashion of Indian Chintz, we selected essays from altogether 16 international scholars whose names you see listed here, again from around the world, based in the US, in India, and in Europe. In the photo, you can see some of the authors gathered at the ROM in June 2018, when we pulled over 90 pieces from ROM collections to study them together. So this is often the first step in the exhibit, is getting to know very well and becoming very good friends with the objects that are going to appear in the exhibit. So I extend my big thanks to this wide group of both passionate and generous experts. I also extend thanks to our ROM in-house photographers. Now, I promised to share some behind the scenes stories, and this is one of them. For the preparation of the catalog and exhibit, ROM photography took over 3,000 images. And in fact, you see here Brian Boyle, who was a photographer at the ROM for over 35 years and recently retired. And his last picture in his long and storied career was taking photographs of our ROM pieces of painted printed cottons. For this, he both needed to take up close details as well as build scaffolding and even move some heat vents in order to get overviews of some of the enormous pieces that I'll be sharing with you. So what are painted and printed cottons, and how and why did India master this art? Now, scholars refer to them as mordant and resist-dyed cottons, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means. Today, we take for granted our printed cottons, our t-shirts and tea towels, and everything else that has printed design on them. But these are modern inventions that date really only to the early 1800s. It is in fact very difficult to get natural dye colors to adhere to cotton. And it was artisans in India who mastered and perfected the techniques. Now, they used what may seem to us simple ingredients such as rusty iron, buffalo milk, molasses, roots, and seeds, but they combine these ingredients to create what are in fact very complicated chemical reactions. Now, Indian artisans had access to potent dyes that are native to India. These include indigofera shrubs that give the color blue, turmeric, like the turmeric we use in cooking, the rhizomes or roots of this to make yellow, and the root of several rubiaceae plant species, including the chayavar that is found only in southern India and Sri Lanka and gives the most vivid red for which these Indian cottons were famous. India's strong sun and its calcium-rich waters also contributed and gave it some natural advantages. But used alone, these ingredients will not produce color. Instead, as I mentioned, they require complex chemical reactions and manipulations. So to create red, purples, and black, Indian artisans applied dye agents or metallic salts known as mordants, and these bind the plant dye to the cotton. To create pattern in blue requires a different process known as resist dyeing, wherein you apply wax or mud or some other substance that will resist the dye bath when you immerse your cloth into an indigo vat. And at the same time, to get the blue to adhere to the cotton, you have to adjust alkaline levels using processes such as fermentation and then oxidization to get it to adhere. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the secrets and the magic behind Indian cotton color. Now, I'm also going to tell you that a synonym for these painted and printed cottons is the word chintz. Now, we think of the term chintz maybe as being a flowered cotton cloth made in England, but in fact, this use of the term chintz only happened after the 19th century. Up to that time, the term chintz was applied to the originals that were made in India, so India's own painted and printed cotton. So I will be referring to them in this lecture as Indian chintz. This large painted Indian cotton that you see before you, that dates to about the year 1740, probably took 10 different specialists and 6 months to complete. After all the dye applications, washings, it would then be polished with a shell, given a glaze of rice water, and in this particular case then gilded with gold leaf. Now, Indian artisans historically applied mordants and resists, these substances, to create pattern using 2 different types of tools. They could use a special bamboo pen that is called the column, which is a sharpened bamboo stick around which wool is wrapped, and into this you soak your mordants or your wax resist, and then you squeeze on it to release this onto the cotton. Or you could use printed wooden printing blocks. Now, these are hand-carved blocks with various designs on them that you then stamp onto the cotton surface. Now, each of these techniques requires additional special ingredients. If you're going to be hand painting, you need to coat your surface with buffalo milk to prevent the colors from bleeding. And if you are printing, you need to mix a thickener into your mordant in order for it to adhere to the block and then transfer to the cloth. So neither technique, printing nor painting, is straightforward or simple. So how to convey this complicated knowledge to viewers? We devote 3 cases to the tools and ingredients, which really are the building blocks for creating these amazing textiles. The tools range from a tiny hand spindle for spinning cotton to a set of sturdy printing blocks to commissioned sets that illustrate the main steps in building up color and pattern. We include actual samples of some of the main ingredients that I've mentioned: rusty nails, seeds to help ferment the indigo, and a rare example of India's native chayavar root, which gave the amazing brilliant red. Now, painting and printing cottons was widespread across India, from the Punjab to West Bengal. But two main areas in India produced painted and printed cottons for export. These were Gujarat and Rajasthan to the west and north, and coastal Southeast India, also known as the Coromandel Coast, to the southeast. So most of the pieces that we have on display originate in either Gujarat or in Southeast India. Now, the ROM has one of the world's great collections of Indian painted and printed cottons, or chintz, especially 18th century pieces that were made in India for export to Europe, also known as Indo-European chintz. Now, counting every fragment, the ROM has about 300 pieces. The bulk of it came to the museum as a donation in 1934 from the estate of Harry Werne. Werne was a British-born designer of textiles and wallpaper, and he assembled his own private collection of Indian chintz in Europe around 1920 in order to serve as a design archive for his own textile designs. The Werne collection was last seen in a special exhibit at the ROM in 1970. This was the landmark exhibit and publication, Origins of Chintz. But we in 2020, 50 years later, decided to tell a new story. We have in the interim added new pieces to the ROM collections, and scholars have also in the past 50 years made many new discoveries about the cloth and the full extent of its global trade. So for our new exhibition, we chose to expand the story in time and space. We looked to the origin of the art in India, and we examined all the different kinds of cloth that Indian artisans made to export around the world, not only to Europe, but also to Asia and parts of Africa. We also bring our exhibit up to the present date, celebrating all of the revivals and innovations that have been taking place in India in the past 10 years. So conceptually and physically, we have divided our exhibit of 4,000 square feet into 4 major sections, and I will walk you through each of these. First, we have Indian roots, the origins of chintz in India. Second, we have Clothing the World, taking a world tour of the different products that were made in India for the tastes and desires of customers around the world. We look in our third section of what we call the consequence of desire, what happened due to this global demand for India's cottons and how it still impacts us today. And then fourth, we look at contemporary production in India of both furnishing fabrics and also high fashion. So the first section of our exhibit makes India the starting point. It explores the deep historic roots of India's own patronage of painted and printed cottons. That is, fabrics and fashions made in India for Indian consumers. We open with the stunning piece, a court palace banner from Tamil Nadu that is over 350 years old, made around 1650. It measures 9 meters by 6 meters and likely depicts the Nayaka ruler of Madurai seated on an elephant in a royal procession. It is on loan from the Berge Ashtian Gallery in Paris, and this is the first time it has ever been displayed in any museum. It's actually just one panel of 9 that were probably originally joined and measured 30 meters all together, showing the ruler in different court scenes. It speaks to the color, the energy, and the grandeur of painted cottons made historically for India's own elites. But we also include humbler pieces to represent rural dwellers who also patronized Indian chintz. We represent country fashions with a block printed Rajasthani woman's skirt from the 1950s. The design might look simple, but the patterns and colors of these skirts communicated often the age, the status of the woman, and sometimes her group. Temple is represented by a contemporary Matani Pashedi, or Mother Goddess hanging, from Ahmedabad, Gujarat. We commissioned it in 2019 from the artist Chitara Chandrakot. Historically, the Chitara families block printed their religious hangings, but in recent years, several artists have begun painting the cloths and making names for themselves in the art world circles. So this illustrates from the beginning how Indian chintz is a living art being taken in new directions by new practitioners. Now, since India alone truly mastered coloring cottons, it is not surprising that outside of India, other people and nations wanted this extraordinary cloth. It has been said thus that Indian chintz created the first global fashion. And that is the first way it changed the world. India was not only master of cotton and color, but also of design. Indian artists were geniuses at customizing color and design to suit many different world markets. So you can see here a wide variety of shapes, forms, colors, and design that were made in the 18th century for export to different global markets. So a large part of our exhibit is taking this world tour to see more closely these different varieties. We begin in Egypt, of all places. It's a cruel twist of history that few examples of older Indian chintz survived in India itself because of the monsoons and humidity of India. And it may not surprise you to know that actually the oldest pieces have been found in arid Egypt. They were made in medieval times in India and then exported over maritime channels to India. The ROM has a small collection of 32 of these archaeological fragments that have been found in Egypt, which are both painted and block printed. The most luxurious and expensive feature 3 colors, red, white, and blue, and some have intricate Arabic inscriptions. The oldest piece in the show dates to about 1250 or 1280, and it is this extraordinary fragment with the red ground on which we can see flowering trees. Now, after 750 years, the red is still vibrant, which underscores again the mastery of Indian artisans for color. Now, how do we know the date of it? Well, we know because we had several of our Indo-Egyptian fragments carbon-14 dated at the Arizona University Laboratories by director Gregory Hodgins, who is a native of Barrie, Ontario. So we are thankful to Gregory. In addition to the red flowering tree piece, we also have a block printed indigo and white piece that also has retained its extraordinary brightness of color, and it dates to about 1400 to 1450. Again, almost as vibrant as probably the day it was made. Next, we move to Indonesia. The many islands that make up Indonesia imported huge quantities of Indian chintz for over 500 years. Until the 1700s, spices such as nutmeg, mace, and cloves grew only in the tiny islands of eastern Indonesia, and they were valued around the world, not only to flavor food, but at the time also to preserve food, and they were also believed to have medicinal properties. The trade in these precious spices was controlled by large, powerful empires on Indonesia's larger Western islands. So all the world was coming to Indonesia for its spices, but in turn, the spice merchants in Indonesia would generally only exchange their spices for Indian chintz. So merchants from everywhere first had to go to India to get the correct types to please these merchants in Indonesia. Our exhibit displays 8 examples to show the wide range of design tastes across all of these islands. The great courts of Sumatra and Java desired enormous pieces that were worn as great skirts at ceremonial events. Now, the design on these range from bold graphic sunbursts to intricate patchwork imitations that are virtuoso illustrations of intricate design. Now, the rural people who grew and gathered spices desired different types of cloth, as you can see here. They preferred bold floral and bird designs on narrow banners, which they used to display at ancestral ceremonies, hanging these banners from the roofs of their tall clan houses or using them to wrap elders or offerings. The two pieces on the left are on loan from Banu and Jiva Parpia of Ithaca, New York, and we thank them again for this generous loan. Now, besides Indonesia, Thailand was also an important importer of Indian chintz in the 18th century. In Thailand, only the king and his court were allowed to dress in Indian chintz. It was considered such a luxurious, rare, and high prestige cloth. And in fact, annually, the king would send agents to commission pieces in southeastern India. Here you see a tunic that would have been worn by the royal Thai bodyguard. And behind it, you can see a man's waist wrapper of exquisite wax resist detail and over 5 colors. It has also been gilded with gold leaf. And another behind the scenes secret, in order to make that gold leaf shimmer and shine in the gallery, it took all the special skills of our lighting specialist, Bob Walsh, who can be seen here adjusting the lighting on another of our spectacular pieces covered in gold leaf at the start of the show. Now, not to spoil some of the magic from the exhibition, but many of the large pieces that you've seen just seem to float in space, but of course they aren't floating. They've had to be mounted with ingenious techniques. Some of them are rolled. Others have been mounted using magnets. This is a system that has been pioneered by ROM technicians Carla Livingston and Christina Lade. But here you see a very large group effort led by our chief textiles conservator, Chris Polisic. They are placing the felt to then roll, as you can see, the piece on the left out, and up above are the magnets that are colored to match the textile that will help anchor it across the top so that you can see the full length of this piece. Another typical type with lotus and duck motif that was made for export to Indonesia. Now, Indian chintz artisans made pieces for many religions. On the left is a prayer mat made for export to Iran with characteristic cypress trees, a prayer niche, and script preferred by Islamic markets. On the right is a Christian priest cloak or cope, complete with angels and cross. The Armenian inscriptions on it show it was made for an Armenian priest in 1787. Now, our challenge with this piece is that with the Armenian cope is that at some point a pesky mouse has apparently chewed through the piece, leaving a series of holes. Now, we did not want our viewers distracted by this, so enter the magic of our conservation team. Conservator Anne-Marie Guichardi ingeniously created digitally printed patches to hide the holes and have the garment with a completed look. Now, if 30% of the gallery is dedicated to Asia, 30% of the exhibition shows Indian chintz trade textiles made for export to the European market. Europe from about 1650 became one of the major consumers of Indian chintz. From around the year 1500, Europeans too began sailing to Asia in search of spices. And for about 100 years, spices were their main trade. However, these European trade companies from Portugal, Britain, France, began also carrying Indian chintz back to Europe. And by 1650, it had become a true fashion craze. Indian chintz was altogether novel in Europe, where cotton does not grow and was unknown. It was superior to the linen and wool that was worn in Europe at the time, in that it was washable and could achieve these bright colors. And it was less expensive than silk, which was the main luxury fiber at the time. So Indian chintz began actually as a fashion, as a furnishing fabric. And elite Europeans used it to cover the walls of their bedrooms, studies, libraries. They also covered their beds with it, their large poster beds, as canopies and curtains, and some even used it to cover the chairs. The most fashionable thing you could do was to have a bedroom decked out in matching Indian chintz, and that's what our large wall hangings are in the exhibition. They're known as palanquors, and these were used to cover the beds and walls of these elite European homes in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, for these fabrics, Europeans favored designs that were both familiar and unfamiliar. We find on them flowers and animals that come from Europe, from an imagined China or chinoiserie, and even from India. Our ROM botanist Deb Metzger has determined that some of the animals and plants portrayed are inspired by Indian species, such as flying squirrels and Indian almonds that the chintz painters might have observed in their own environment. Now, installing these enormous wall hangings, some over 9 meters high, was a challenge. And our team had to use a scissor lift or a cherry picker in many instances to be able to install them. By 1650, East India companies were making more money than carrying Indian cottons back to Europe than spices. And they started to import large quantities, up to 1 million pieces a year. Now, by this time, Indian chintz had also become a dress fashion. Elite women wore it in fashionable silhouettes, as you see here. And men began to wear it as informal dressing gowns known as banyans that they wore in informal settings to receive friends and families at home. Soon, servants and working women too desired it. Europeans also took chintz to their American colleagues, and in this way, Indian chintz became a truly global fashion, existing all around the world and crossing social classes. Now, to represent Canada, we weren't able to find any early pieces of Indian chintz imported into Canada, but we do represent Canada in the exhibit by 2 examples from the 20th century. The first is a block printed ensemble designed by Sarah Puleo of the Sarah Closed label. From 1976 to 96, Puleo spent half of the year in Ottawa and half the year in Jaipur, Rajasthan, where she designed clothing and homewares from printed cottons that she both purchased and commissioned. The Sarah Closed label was carried in department stores and boutiques across Canada and remains well known amongst Canadian audiences. The second block printed cotton, made by Indian artisans for export to Canada, is an early product from Meiwa Handprints of Vancouver. Charlotte Kwan and her company Meiwa of Granville Island have committed to working with the same printing families in Gujarat and Rajasthan for over 30 years. Now, the piece you see here that we've chosen for display was made in the 1990s at the start of Meiwa's collaboration with the Dosea family. Now, because Indian chintz was desired and traded so widely, it is not surprising that Indian chintz was one of the most influential textiles ever made. The third part of our exhibit examines how it influenced art and industries around the world. We call this section Changing the World, or the Consequences of Desire. What you might call the unintended consequences of the global demand for Indian chintz came in 3 basic keys. Now, firstly, Indian chintz influenced handcrafted textiles around the world. Scholars now argue that Indian chintz influenced textile design and techniques from Tahiti to Ghana. We chose to illustrate this with examples of Javanese batik cloth. On the island of Java in Indonesia, women created their own tools and processes to apply wax and dye, sometimes emulating Indian design, which came and went in fashion. But mainly, they created their own local designs that reflect local cosmological beliefs. Now, the second way that Indian chintz changed the world was inspiring imitations in Europe. In essence, scholars now argue that Indian chintz kickstarted the Industrial Revolution. In a nutshell, Indian chintz was such a profitable commodity in Europe that from the early 1600s, Europeans began imitating it. It took them nearly 100 years to observe, record, experiment, and do a lot of trial and error to master India's hand techniques of printing, mordant dyeing, and sun bleaching. But from about 1770, Britain especially was able to produce quality equal to India's printed cottons. And yet, Europeans still relied on imports of Indian plain cotton on which to print. They needed to overcome this dependence. So British entrepreneurs mechanized cotton cloth production. This gave rise to the first modern factories, and the rest is history. It's given rise to our industrial factory system that is now global, with all the social and environmental ills that we are beginning to question today. And so, by about the year 1800, Britain had replaced India as the major exporter of printed cottons. We illustrate this 180-degree turn with this British factory-printed kerchief factory. It was printed on roller printing machinery in a British factory with designs especially created to suit or please Indian consumers, including Lord Ganesh and India playing cards. Unlike the natural dyes of the past, it is printed using synthetic dyes that could be directly printed onto cotton. Now, as you might imagine, one consequence of this British industrial takeover printing cottons was the displacement of Indian artisans. Thousands of Indian cotton spinners and weavers lost their jobs, their livelihoods. Now, printers and painters were able to continue in small numbers, but many had to begin creating no longer for elites, but mostly simple products for rural clienteles. Now, a second consequence of the industrial takeover in Europe of printing cottons was the fact that Europe itself could not grow cotton. It doesn't have the correct climate for cotton growing. Britain, in particular, relied on imports of cotton fiber from the Americas. And this, in turn, led to the intensification of African enslavement in the US to grow this cotton. From 1770 to 1830, slavers trafficked over 170,000 Africans to the US just to work cotton. Another 1 million already enslaved Africans residing on the eastern seaboard of the US were forcibly separated from their families and sold to the Deep South in order to grow cotton in this particularly brutal plantation system. Some of the roots of systemic racism and violence in North America that remain today can be traced back to cotton slavery and the insatiable global demand for cotton cloth. Now, until very recently, conventional wisdom held that these European factory-printed imitations of Indian chintz basically wiped out India's own handcrafted versions, but that is not entirely the case. Now, it is true that by about 1961, maybe only a dozen cotton painters remained in India. Again, as I mentioned, making modest products, mainly for modest local clients. However, through all these peaks and valleys, artisans carried forward nearly all of the techniques and knowledge of the past into the present. And in fact, in the past 10 years, there has been an amazing renaissance in block printing and painting cottons in India using natural dyes. It has been propelled by several factors, including local and global desires for slow fashion, or what people call conscious luxury. That is handcrafted pieces made from sustainable techniques. So India chintz today is again valued and sought for fashion and elite fine art home furnishings. So our fourth and final section celebrates this contemporary chintz making in India and how artisans are reviving and innovating in technique and design. Now, there were actually quite a few artists to choose from, And for our exhibition, we chose to privilege those who put natural dyes at the forefront of their practice. They include Ajit Kumar Das of Kolkata, who explores personal and biographic subject matter using both the column pen as well as modern paintbrushes to achieve his fine detail. Here you see one example from his Stone series, which explores the anxieties of his early career when he switched from a stable government job to becoming an independent artist, and some of the hardships and worries of this change in his professional path. Now, very different is Renika Reddy of Bangalore, who is reviving long lost techniques of Indian chintz, such as painting with wax, and who is inspired by 18th century Indo-European design. And for the ROM, for our exhibition, created this piece, which is based on an 18th century wall hanging from ROM collections. And representing yet another direction is Abdul Jabbar Khatri of Kutch, Gujarat, who explores Islamic design using the very tiny printing blocks that were used in his grandparents' time. But it is in the realm of fashion, perhaps, that India Chintz today knows its greatest and widest success. Dozens of fashion designers in India are using this heritage textile for runway and ready-made fashions. We chose to highlight 4 designers or companies or artists that promote natural dyes and sustainable practices. They include saris made by master artisan M. Kailasham of Hyderabad, as well as the Prashin studio of Mumbai. We have some contemporary funky silhouettes that come from the 2020 Sindhu line of menswear from Good Earth, as well as a woman's tunic from the design label 1111 that is based in New Delhi and has put out a hand-painted line on silk. Now, to appreciate the full range of textile chintz fashions today in India required several trips to India by myself and colleagues Alexandra Palmer and Ilanid Edwards. We made several trips in 2018 and 2019, and we wish to extend our great thanks to the makers and designers such as Anit Arora of the Peru label, Garupa Chetty, the renowned kalamkari painter, Renika Reddy, and many others who shared their insights and knowledge on these trips. Mounting fashion also proved to be a challenge for the exhibit. No mannequin can suit every purpose, so all of the mannequins have been either custom made or custom adapted for each of our different fashions. So I wish to acknowledge the brilliant work of our technicians, Carla Livingston and Christina Lottie, who undertook this work, and which in the end also included covering all of our mounts in indigo fabric, as we decided to cover all our mannequins in indigo in order to stress the global unity and love for Indian chintz everywhere in the world. In order to allow chintz artists to speak directly themselves to Canadian audiences, we commissioned 4 filmed interviews, each about 3 minutes, where the artists described their work and professional pathways. The interviews were filmed and conducted by Indranil Lahiri and Vandana Radhakrishnan and edited by the ROM's AV specialist, Daniela Rupolo. We do hope you will have the opportunity to see the exhibit in person. Nothing, of course, compares to seeing the objects in colors in real life. But if that isn't possible, I hope I've been able to share the heart and soul of the exhibit, some of the extraordinary artworks that are in it, and the dedication of our exhibition team. Thank you once again. We hope to see you soon.